Hi, my name's Ejfa Savage. I'm an Englishman in New York. I'm the CEO of Chazon, Hebrew for Vision, which is the Jewish Lab for Sustainability and is the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community. I think, like most of the world's religious traditions, Jewish tradition is really deeply grounded in a certain kind of reverence for the world. I think that regardless of one's theology, there is the notion in Jewish tradition, not that the world is ours, but that God created it and we're here to tend it. I think more interestingly, Jewish tradition doesn't have a lot of language around rights, with the generation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the right to life, liberty, and happiness and so forth. Jewish tradition is built around obligations. It's built around mitzvot. And to grow up within Jewish tradition is to grow up quite deeply within a sense of mutual obligation. And I think that that has been true for every generation Jewishly for 25 centuries. But I think at this particular moment in the world, it has particular consequences. What is it that Jewish tradition has to offer? What is it that I've learned these last few years? I think there are a few different things. I think the first one is just thinking about human psychology in relationship to the climate crisis. In general, I think that we want two things of our crises. Firstly, we want to be able to define success. And secondly, we want not to be the bad guys. So for example, if you take the fight against apartheid, one could say, shouldn't there be a free democratic South Africa? Wouldn't it be amazing if Nelson Mandela were president? And it took many hundreds of thousands of people over many decades, but in due course, there was a free democratic South Africa and Nelson Mandela was president. And the same was true of the fight against slavery and all sorts of things. In relationship to the climate crisis, there is no likelihood at any point in our lifetime of seeing the headline in the New York Times, great news, climate change fixed, go back to how you were. So the first thing is that that's really a problem. And I think that we insufficiently pay attention to that. The second thing makes it worse, because again, in relationship to apartheid, one could say, oh, they're racist, but I'm not racist. They're a slave owner, I'm not a slave owner, whatever it may be. But in relationship to the climate crisis, we can talk about bad guys and we can talk about the oil companies and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, every single one of us in the West, for sure, has simply grown up with presumptions of normal life, which are actually literally unsustainable. And that also is a huge problem, because we don't like feeling that we don't have moral high ground. And one of the things that I've learned in doing the work that we have been doing at Chazon over the last many years is that I think environmentalists pay insufficient attention to this, because people don't necessarily want to say it, but they feel bad and they feel guilty, and it's actually an impediment to action. So I think that we have to begin by acknowledging that we can't easily define success. And I think that we have to begin by acknowledging that we feel a little bit equivocal about this. And then we have to go beyond that. And that's where I think Jewish tradition, again, is wise. 2,000 years ago, one of the foundational books of Jewish wisdom, the Talmud, has this famous line, you're not required to complete the task, but neither can you desist from it. And I think that that's true in relationship to the climate crisis. We have to acknowledge that we can't define success. We have to acknowledge that we feel bad about it. So we have to acknowledge that we can't define success. We have to accept that we feel bad about it. And then we turn to wisdom from Jewish tradition. You're not required to complete the task, but neither can you desist from it. And it's on the other side of it that we, each of us as individuals, but also each of us within our communities, however we define them, have to try and figure out what do we do about this, because we're over-consuming the world and the consequences are steadily getting worse. And I think that, I would say two things. One focused at the level of an individual and one focused at an institution. As an individual, I think that we have to do three things. Number one, make some further change in your own behavior. Ride your bike, fly less, eat less meat. We all know that there are changes in our behavior that we need to make. They will not, in and of themselves, add up to sufficient change, but they're the things that we need to do to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and to be able to speak up with some sense of integrity. Number two, we then need to speak up within any institutions that we find ourselves. In any synagogue or church or mosque or gurdwara, in any place of work, in any college campus, in any student setting, in any school, we need to speak up and say, what is this institution doing about the climate crisis? And then thirdly, we need to put in time or money. We need to give money to organizations doing this work, and we need to say, okay, I will pitch in. And that then leads on to institutions. What should institutions be doing? At Chazon, we've developed a Chazon seal of sustainability, but truthfully, there are lots of different versions of this out there. But fundamentally, every institution needs to say, yes, this is key to who we are, as well as anything else that we're doing. A growing number of institutions have commitments to abide by the law, commitments around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, all kinds of things. Any institution, a law firm, a barbershop, a school, whatever it is, needs to say, okay, we can't fix this today or tomorrow. We're in the world of COVID. We haven't got enough time. We haven't got enough money, but neither can we fail to address this. So we're going to commit as an organization that this is important. We're going to pass a board resolution to commit ourselves to it. We're going to give ourselves a multi-year run at it. And then year by year, month by month, we are going to flesh out what that means for us as an institution. And the changes that institutions will make will change depending on what kind of an institution it is. But that's how collectively we start to drive systemic change. One question that many people ask is, well, that's great, but what does it mean in practice? So let me give one very specific example. Let's think about food. Food is, as it happens, central to Jewish tradition, though truthfully it's central to every tradition. But in Jewish tradition, we have the notion of keeping kosher. And the word kosher literally means fit, as in, is this fit for me to eat? And traditionally, somebody who is Jewishly observant doesn't eat pork, doesn't eat shellfish, because they're not kosher. Well, in the 21st century, the question, is this fit for me to eat, is now a question for everybody. And so as an institution, it's a really interesting thing for an institution to come together and say, let's come together, not immediately, let's give time, over 6 or 12 months, and let's establish a food policy. And by the way, let's ask these questions, these following questions genuinely, not rhetorically. What's the food that we eat? Where does it come from? How are the workers treated? How are the animals treated? How is the land treated? Do we serve soda? Why or why not? Do we use plastic bottles? Why or why not? Do we serve meat? What about the interfaith piece? What about food justice? What about our neighbors? What is going on in our city and our community? What about the Farm Bill? And for an institution to come together in any part of this country, in any part of the world, and ask those questions with intellectual integrity, meaning treating them as real questions, treating them as an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to bring people together. It's necessary, I think, to be incredibly gentle. Food is not just ethics, it's also memory and appetite and family and culture and economics and all kinds of things. So we need to be gentle with ourselves and respectful and tolerant with other people. But properly done, a conversation about food played out over time within an institution will drive change. If we think of those cigarette ads from the 1950s, smoked Chestertons, they're good for your throat. We look at them now with disbelief. Well, very soon we're going to be looking at a certain kind of TV series set in an American high school in the 1990s, and it's going to have a soda machine there with Coke and Pepsi. And we're going to look back and we were like, what were we thinking, right? It leads to obesity. The plastic bottles take 300 years to biodegrade in the Pacific Ocean. Like, how could we possibly have had soda machines in high schools? And so change is happening around food. The process of gradually ending industrial meat production will actually end misery for animals. It will help human beings be healthier. But it is also the case that industrial meat and dairy is one of the two largest anthropogenic drivers of climate change. It's one of the two most significant ways that we're negatively impacting the climate. And I don't think that it is helpful. Let me say this clearly. I don't think it's helpful to go around and bang people over the head and say, you must not eat meat, or you cannot do this, or you cannot do that. But what I think is valuable is to open up the conversation. Let's ask where our meat comes from. Let's find out about it. Let's find out about how the animals are treated and the workers are treated. Let's learn about the consequences of our meat consumption. And slowly but surely, person by person, institution by institution, we will change how we eat and we'll make the world a better place. Before the Copenhagen environmental talks, I had the honor of leading a Jewish delegation to a high-end interfaith gathering in Britain, actually at Windsor Castle. And I had the opportunity to speak very briefly, as it were, on behalf of the Jewish people to this gathering of the leaders from every faith tradition around the world. And I was very intimidated by this. And I was trying to figure out what on earth I would say. And in the end, and slightly to my surprise, I found myself talking about hope. I think that hope is a Jewish virtue. And I think there is a distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism is the expectation that things will be better. Hope is the determination that we should make things better. And if you ask if I'm optimistic, I'm not sure if I am. I've been thinking recently about the definition of the optimist and the pessimist says, I just don't see how things could possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, I think I can. So in that sense, I'm not necessarily optimistic, but I do very deeply believe in hope. I do very deeply believe that hope is a Jewish virtue. The Jewish people has been through many vicissitudes over 20 centuries. Exiled from the land of Israel, a temple destroyed, anti-Semitism in different eras and different places, the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century. And at every stage, literally in every century and in every country, the Jewish people has bounced back, and has not merely bounced back with a determination to renew the Jewish people. That's almost the least of it. But in every place and every time, to be Jewish has meant quite literally working for a better world for everybody. And so I think that hope is a Jewish virtue. And I think it would be my blessing for you and me and all of us that we should have hope and that we should work to make that hope come to fruition. Look, two last things. COVID, firstly, is both a metaphor and an inspiration. It's a metaphor for how we are damaging the world, and in the course of it, damaging ourselves. And that if we don't pay attention to our behavior, it will come back and bite us, on the one hand. And on the other hand, in response to COVID, we did all sorts of things that people thought you couldn't do. We made changes across all of our countries and all of our societies, spinning on a dime. And so if we can do it in relationship to COVID, we can do it in relationship to the climate crisis. And that leads me to the second thing, which is that many of us have been traveling around with a particular dark cloud traveling over our heads in the recent period, which for some of us has stretched back quite a few years. And history changes. There are inflection points. And we could be at a point 6 months or 12 months from now where we have a different government, a different sense of commitment, a different public will for change. And we could be at a moment in the United States, across the West, in many different countries, in which there is really incredible energy and momentum for change. And I hope that that happens, and I hope that we work to help make it happen. So I've been thinking about the definition of the optimist and the pessimist. And the pessimist says, I just don't see how things could possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, I think I can. So my name is Ejfa Savage. I'm the CEO of Khazan, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability, and the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community. We're working to turn the Jewish community outwards to work for a more sustainable world for everybody. And I've learned a couple of things these last few years that I want to share with you, regardless of your religious background. Number one, we each have to do something. We have to acknowledge that we feel bad, acknowledge that we can't define success, but we have to A, make some further change in our own behavior, B, speak up in every place that we can, and C, put in at least some time and money to try and make a difference for good. And then secondly, in any institution, a company, a place of work, a place of education, the institution as an organization, the board itself, needs to commit to a multi-year process of change, needs to say it is on all of us now in the 21st century to work for a more sustainable world for everybody. We can't fix it by ourselves, but we can't not seek to address these issues. What's the food that we serve? What's the energy that we consume? What education do we do? How do we be better citizens? That's a question for everybody. And the last thing that I want to say, coming out of Jewish tradition, is I want to offer us all a sense of hope. That's why I start with the optimist and the pessimist. I may not be optimistic in terms of being confident that things will be better, but I'm absolutely persuaded that we all need to have a sense of hope. And one last thing, the reason that I started with optimism and pessimism, it's not that I'm necessarily optimistic that I expect that things will be better, but I absolutely believe that hope is a Jewish virtue and a good virtue for all of us. And we should do this work from a place of hope. We should act from a place of hope to create the kind of world that we want to imagine. So I've been thinking about the definition of the optimist and the pessimist. And the pessimist says, I just don't see how things could possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, I think I can. So my name is Ejfa Savage. I'm the CEO of Khazan, the Jewish Lab for Sustainability, and the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community. We're working to turn the Jewish community outwards to work for a more sustainable world for everybody. And I've learned a couple of things these last few years that I want to share with you, regardless of your religious background. Number one, we each have to do something. We have to acknowledge that we feel bad, acknowledge that we can't define success, but we have to A, make some further change in our own behavior, B, speak up in every place that we can, and C, put in at least some time and money to try and make a difference for good. And then secondly, in any institution, a company, a place of work, a place of education, the institution as an organization, the board itself, needs to commit to a multi-year process of change, needs to say it is on all of us now in the 21st century to work for a more sustainable world for everybody. We can't fix it by ourselves, but we can't not seek to address these issues. What's the food that we serve? What's the energy that we consume? What education do we do? How do we be better citizens? That's a question for everybody. And the last thing that I want to say, coming out of Jewish tradition, is I want to offer us all a sense of hope. That's why I start with the optimist and the pessimist. I may not be optimistic in terms of being confident that things will be better, but I'm absolutely persuaded that we all need to have a sense of hope. And one last thing, the reason that I started with optimism and pessimism, it's not that I'm necessarily optimistic that I expect that things will be better, but I absolutely believe that hope is a Jewish virtue and a good virtue for all of us. And we should do this work from a place of hope. We should act from a place of hope to create the kind of world that we want to imagine.